Thank you, Ms. Buck. A pleasure to serve under your chairship. I'm not sure if it constitutes an interest under the legislation, but I am a member of PCS, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm happy to declare it before I can begin my remarks. I'd like to support my honourable friend from Glasgow South West in bringing forward this motion today, and to associate the third party with the body of the remarks that he has made. And I want to make some points in addition. The first is to say that in terms of the United Kingdom government, it really isn't a good look. 3 times over the last 9 years, and under 3 different governments of different political complexions, the workforce of this government has found necessity to take its employer to court. And in 2 out of those 3 occasions, it has won. And that doesn't really speak well in terms of the goodwill and industrial relations inside the civil service and relations between the government and those on whom it depends to implement its policies. So I do think that something is, very awry here that needs to be put right. And even more so when we consider what is about to befall the public sector if Brexit goes ahead, where the degree of upheaval and change and restructuring will be necessary in order to cope with leaving the European Union will undoubtedly require the goodwill and support of the workforce. So I would implore the Minister to try and do what he can in his position to digress from the attitude and the work that has been undertaken by his predecessors. I'd also like to very much support the principles which underline the counter-proposal by the trade unions in terms of the compensation scheme. And I wonder if I can invite the Minister. I don't want him to disclose his hand in negotiations, and it's proper that he responds to the trade unions directly on the 25th of March. But I wonder if he can indicate whether or not these principles find support from him, because I am very minded to support them. Not just the provisions in trying to focus compensation towards those in the lowest incomes, or those who are being made compulsorily redundant rather than opting for voluntary severance, but most of all, that the compensation should be related to the status of the employee who is being made redundant. Because after all, we're not talking here about a bonus, we're not talking here about a pension scheme, we are talking about compensation for losing your livelihood. And therefore, that compensation ought to take into effect the consequences on the individual and their ability to survive after they leave the civil service. And in that regard, whilst I cast no aspersions on them as workers, but a difference surely has to be made between a relatively high-paid civil servant working around the corner in Whitehall who is made redundant in the centre of the capital city and who has not just the experience but the opportunity to seek alternative employment much more readily than someone working on a basic administrative grade in Gateshead or somewhere else where there may be much more challenges to the labour market. So I think that principle is very much something which I would commend to the government in terms of the approach that they take. Finally, Ms. Buck, as with so many other things, I would commend the Minister to look north for inspiration and to see what is happening across the border in Scotland. Scottish civil servants are, of course, if they're working directly for the government, are under the auspices of this scheme that we're discussing here today. But they constitute only a small part of the public sector national workforce in Scotland. And with regard to the rest, the Scottish Government is undertaking a consultation about severance arrangements in the public sector more generally in Scotland. And in Scotland, they have proceeded on the basis of consultation. The government is not being taken to court. There is not an imminent dispute from the civil servants' trade unions. So if it can be done correctly in Edinburgh, perhaps the Minister here could take inspiration and make sure it is done correctly in Westminster.